Ya.
Kita mulai aja ya.
Ya.
Oke, good morning Indonesian time, Bapak dan Ibu and fellow students of UGM, and good evening US time for Arnout, and nice to see you again in this virtual discussions. After we have a panel in IFIS Michigan's Conference of Indonesian Studies in last June. And today, the Department of History is grateful for having Dr. Arnout van der Meer discussing his book at UGM, although it is virtually. I hope we can encounter face-to-face in the future. And Arnout van der Meer is an associate professor of history at Colby College, US, where he teaches the history of Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And his research explores how power in the late colonial Indonesia was transmitted, legitimized, and challenged through everyday forms of resistance via language, dress, etiquette, social custom, and consumerism. And his research resulted in various publications in the some of international journals, such as Journal of World History, Bihragen voor de Taal en Volkenkunde, and Transregional and National Studies of Southeast Asia. And most recently, his book, which will be discussed today, Performing Power, Cultural Hegemony, Identity, and Resistance in Late Colonial Indonesia, was published by Cornell University Press in 2021. And through today's discussions, Arnout will discuss his book on the articulations of the modern identity of the Javanese people in their daily interactions, contesting colonial hegemony in the 19th and early 20th century. And as a discussions of this book, we have Dr. Sri Margana, lecturer in the Department of History at UGM, and also Van Chair Professor for Early Modern History of Indonesia at the Leiden University. And Pak Margana is a historian with expertise in Javanese history and early modern history of Indonesia. And he has written many books on the history of Java in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the structure of today's book discussions, first of all, Dr. Abdul Wahid, the head of History Department of UGM, will deliver an opening speech around 5 to 10 minutes. And after that, Arnold will begin his presentations of his book for 30 minutes, followed by a response from Pak Margana for 15 minutes. And after that, Arnold replies the comments from Pak Margana for again 15 minutes, and after that we will have a Q&A with the participants present for the rest of the time. And before we begin discussions, I give the floors to Dr. Abdul Wahid to give an opening speech for this book discussions. Please, Pak Wahid.
Thank you so much, Mas Wildan. Very good morning to everyone, and good evening, Arnout, especially. Welcome to our program today. So today we are very honored to have Dr. Arnout van der Meer, Indonesian researcher, an expert in Indonesian history. He is teaching at Colby College of the United States, Maine. I think this is really good opportunity also to us in the history department, especially the students from undergraduate until graduate program, to learn and to listen directly from the author of the books. And I think this is really a good opportunity also to everyone here who's joining our program to know that the book is an open access, so you can download the book for free, and you have an opportunity then to give a kind of introduction this morning from the author. So first of all, I would like to thank to Dr. Arnout van der Meer for your kind willingness to share your book, to introduce your book to our student, but also to our audience here in Indonesia. I think this book is very important contribution to the historiography of Indonesia in the late colonial period, especially. The book concern or focus on very important issues about the political, cultural politics in that period. And this is the period that perhaps has a very special position in Indonesian historiography. We know in our historiography, the period has been called as a national awakening period or the national movement period. Yet much of the discussion or much of the book concern about the political development, the awareness of nationalism among Indonesia. And the book we will discuss today, or we will listen today, open up more dimensions about the period. It's touched upon the cultural aspect of that period, shed more light about how the Javanese elite positioning themselves in this, the so-called the edge of motions in Takashi Shiraishi word, perhaps, and then understand how they try to challenge the cultural hegemony through various forms of cultural activities. So thank you so much, Arnout, for joining us, but also for your time to share your valuable time with us. And I would like also to thank Pak Margana, who will be discussing the book in a minute. And I wish we have a nice discussion this morning. And just for information for everyone, this kind of a program is a regular program from our Department of History. So please be alert with our informations on our website, and we will have more programs like this in the coming weeks or coming months. So thank you everyone. Terima kasih semuanya sudah bergabung dengan kami di ruang virtual ini. Semoga kita bisa mendapatkan diskusi yang mencerahkan pagi ini. So thank you so much, and have a very fruitful discussion. And thank you. Well then, I return to you.
Okay, terima kasih banyak Pak Wahid for the opening speech. And yeah, we directly move to Arnout to give his book presentations. So Arnout, you have 30 minutes to deliver your presentations. So the floor is yours, Arnout, please.
So first of all, thank you all so much for being here with me this morning. For me, it's evening here at 9 p.m. And Mas Wildan, thank you so much. It's a pleasure meeting you again after meeting you earlier this summer. And I do wish the same, that we could meet in person soon. And definitely, Pak Wahid, Pak Margana, thank you so much for making this possible, for having me here today, for the whole department at UGM. It's a real honor and a real pleasure for me to share my book today with all of you and share my research, and I look forward to our conversation. And it's under normal circumstances, I would have wished for us to have this meeting in person. And it's my hope that somewhere in the future, when travel is a bit more possible and normal, I could visit you and meet all of you in person. But today, I feel very fortunate that I can still, through Zoom, share my recent publication with you. So what I would like to do today is, and I apologize, my spoken Indonesian is very rough right now. I haven't been to Indonesia in a few years because of COVID. I'm going to do this in English. So I hope if anybody has problems following it, or if you have questions, please let me know, and I'll make sure to make my arguments very clear. To help, I've also created a PowerPoint, so I will share my screen, and hopefully that would, there we go, will help in conveying my arguments. So what I would like today to do in my 30 minutes, and I'll Mas Wildan, just make sure that you feel free to stop me when I go over time. But what I would like today to do today is just talk you through my book. And I've always found when I'm talking about my research, it's easiest to begin with a example, a case study, if you will. For those of you who have been able to look at the book, I like to work with case studies. I think that they're very informative and they're a good way of conceptualizing your research, but also conceptualizing a particular theme or topic. So rather than telling you outright what my book is about, let me then begin with a kind of a historical anecdote, if you will. And this anecdote comes straight from the book. It also comes from the publications that have been mentioned already, and it deals with the story. Oh, there we go. Sorry, that went too fast. Of a very young Javanese man named Raden Sumarsono and his experiences in 1913. And what is so interesting about this story is that in 1913, Raden Sumarsono, who is a public prosecutor at Jaksa, he leaves Batavia, then, or now Jakarta, of course, to be transferred to the town of Purwakarta. And he arrives in Purwakarta, and here he has to serve at the police court, which is led by a European official, a assistant resident, and that is his superior. And at the moment that Sumarsono arrives at the court, he is taken aback. He sees that his fellow countrymen are crouching on the floor, that they are all dressed in traditional Javanese clothing, that they are all addressing this European civil servant, the Dutch civil servant, in High Javanese. And they're all showing him all kinds of symbols of obedience and deference. And Sumarsono was surprised because he is dressed in modern outfit. He wears a suit, he does wear a Javanese headscarf, but he's fluent in Dutch. So he addresses the European civil servant in Dutch. To which the European civil servant responds angrily and increasingly dismissive. He demands that Sumarsono address him in Javanese so that the Javanese language hierarchy can be used to situate their respective social positions. He also requests that Sumarsono immediately go back home and change his outfit into a traditional Javanese outfit. So essentially he wants him to wear a sarong. And he also instructs Sumarsono to sit on the floor. He cannot sit on a chair during this meeting. And a standoff ensues between the two men, in which Sumarsono refuses to change his clothes. He says this is a personal matter, there's no restrictions to what he can wear. To which the European official replies, well, fine, you can stay here at the meeting, but I will not offer you a chair, so you will have to sit on the floor or stand. And at this moment, Sumarsono decides that he has had enough and he walks away. He leaves the meeting at the police court in the hands of the assistant public prosecutor, and he takes his leave. For 2 months, he's no longer welcome at the police courts until a resolution between the two men is found in May of that year. But I'll come back to that later this morning. I want to focus on what happened here between these two people. And what I argue is that what we've seen here is the importance of what I call the everyday staging and the performance of power. It is very clear that in this meeting of these two characters, we see something really interesting. We see expectations. We see a sense of what is appropriate in the colonial encounter. Foremost, we see an expectation on the European or the Dutch civil servant that his power and his status really depends on the way that he's being treated. We see that he expects Sumarsono to crouch on the floor, to wear traditional Javanese dress, to address him in High Javanese, to offer him gestures of obedience and respect, and that these are all measures that would elevate the social status of, in this particular case, the assistant resident. And what I would argue is what we see then here is that hegemony was communicated then through language and manners and status symbols and physical gestures and posture. And it is in these kinds of encounters, because of course this is just one example, but it's in these kinds of encounters, as I would argue, that in everyday life, colonialism was always and continuously communicated. And what is interesting, of course, in this particular case is that that form of communication, I argue, is really meant to uphold and affirm colonial hierarchies of race, class, and gender. This was essential in the colonial state to affirm European positions of superiority, to affirm the social status of this particular case, the European civil servant. But what this particular case study also shows is that it also allows for the contestation of precisely those hierarchies. It allows Sumarsono, by changing his clothes, or by speaking a different language, or by refusing to sit on the floor and demanding to sit on a chair, to subvert these hierarchies. It allows, if you will, for forms of resistance, of what I call everyday resistance. And some of these forms are more subtle, some are more overt, but these are forms that happen in everyday life. And this particular example then illustrates really what is the topic of my book. It's one case study out of many, but I think this is what my book is about, right? Case studies like this are essential to my book. I will come back to the story of Sumarsono throughout this talk today, because he kind of offers us a guide through some of this history. But my larger point here is, oh, and actually, before I continue, let me just, I don't have, of course, any photographs of Sumarsono or of this particular encounter. So I used this particular image that you see on the left here, which is of a different time and era. It's from 1922, where there was a pawn shop strike at the time in Indonesia that was widespread. And this particular image captures that same tension that we see in that everyday encounter that I've just described between Sumarsono and his superior. And here we see, for instance, the people who are on strike in this Dutch political cartoon are represented in modern clothes, and they're depicted as being very arrogant. And they bring in strike breakers, so they bring in other Javanese who are willing to work. And of course, they are depicted as very honorable, and they are wearing traditional Javanese dress. So here we can see the importance of these kinds of elements in terms of the everyday performance of power. So this image kind of captures that. But what for me then is the focus of the book is the various ways in which power is communicated, legitimized, negotiated, and subverted in everyday encounters. And you might wonder, like, is this such an innovative approach? Well, I think it is, because what is really striking to me is, and as Pak Abdul Wahid has already mentioned today, there's a lot of books being published around this particular era in Indonesian history already. But a lot of those books focus on examples of outright political violence, for instance, right? Or rebellions, or revolts, or millenarian movements, or on political parties, right? The histories of Budio Tomo, or Sahakat Islam, or other political movements. And as historian Jan Breman has argued, the problem with this focus on outright political resistance or activism is that it almost leads to the assumption that in between moments of outright political activism, colonialism was passively endured, that there was no resistance. And this particular example of Sumarsono demonstrates that resistance was always present, right? It was not always present in terms of what we would recognize as political resistance or religious resistance, but it was always there. And that is, in a way, oh, I hope that, there we go, oh, sorry. That is what I try to argue here. So it's a shift away from this focus on political resistance. And what it does, it focuses us, or it pulls our focus to other sides of the colonial narrative, other spaces for us to encounter, other spaces for us to explore. In my book, I use several of those spaces. One of the spaces is that one that Sumarsono is in, which is the civil service. The civil service has already been studied often by various historians. And in part, of course, this is because there's a lot of source material here in the colonial archives. We have much information about what happens in the civil service. But there's other spaces too. I already have an image of the pawn shop service that I showed to you earlier, or think of fairgrounds, or think of trains and train stations, or think of movie theaters, think of swimming pools, think of sport clubs, sport fields, think of shopping centers. There are a lot of spaces in late colonial society where colonized and colonizer meet. And it's in these spaces that we can really study the everyday encounter. It's these spaces that have been kind of out of our reach, out of our focus. Households are another example, or mountain resorts, hotels. The list is actually endless. There's a long list of things that we can look at. In effect, what I'm trying to argue here is that we look at these spaces to study this, what I call a continuous cultural struggle between colonizer and colonized. And one of the big takeaways from this that I think is relevant is that it demonstrates that what we call the Indonesian national awakening is not just a movement that is led from a top-down movement, right? This is not a movement simply from highly educated young Indonesian youth who are behind the organization of Budio Tomo or Sahakat Islam or other political movements that follow. But it's also a much broader societal change. It's a much more broader societal resistance against Dutch colonialism that we can see in everyday life. And in this case, the argument is really that it is from this foundation of broad resistance that these other organizations can grow. I don't think this is a overhaul of the traditional narrative, but it's more a complementary notion of this traditional narrative, right? I think the two histories complement each other. And I think this actually helps us explain from where all of these political movements can spring. So it really focuses or shifts our attention away. Again, to kind of explain at least what we see here in the image, it's another example of what we can see in terms of the performance of power. So this is a political cartoon from 1929. It's actually an advertisement. It's not even a political cartoon, which I just encountered by accident in a agricultural newspaper, a Dutch newspaper, and it's an advertisement for a language course, a Sundanese language course. And the implication, if you look at the images here, again, clear, it really reflects this notion, just as what we saw with Sumersono and the superior. And the first image, it says before, we have a European planter who is talking to one of his servants or peasants on the plantation. But again, he's still smoking, he's still wearing his hat, he has his tool in his hands, he's standing as an equal. But then, of course, after this person, after the Dutch planter has learned Sundanese, or so the implication goes, now suddenly this person is sitting on the floor, has taken off his hat, is not smoking, has taken off has laid down his tools, and is sitting and offering obedience to the European planter. Again, here, it's all about the performance of power. In this particular image, the notion is language helps in identifying power. But my argument then is, the opposite is also true, right? This also becomes then a site of contestation and resistance. So hopefully this image helps to convey that notion a bit. In my book, and let's see, there we go. In my book, I recognize several stages of this performance of power, of this broader cultural struggle. And playfully, we could say that in a performance of power, we have several acts, and each act has two scenes, if you will. And all of these overlap with the chapters of my book. So the book has 6 chapters. The first act that I recognize is what I call writing a hegemonic script. And in this particular case, it's all the focus on how do the Dutch try to narrate the story, right? So these are chapters where we actually learn the European perspective. How are Europeans trying to appropriate Javanese deference materials, that Javanese culture to legitimize colonial authority? How do they try to manipulate this? Also, how by the late 19th century do we see a shift with the proclamation of the ethical policy? What we, in sort of more general terms, could describe as a civilizing mission discourse, which is announced in 1901. And it's all about the Dutch attempts to legitimize their power through discourse, but through the performance of power. And it's also about how increasingly there is some resistance, but that resistance is unable to really break through, to undermine this performance of power. And that changes in the second act. And I'll illustrate these in more detail in what's to come. But this changes in the second act, which is roughly consists of 2 chapters that surround the year 1913. And here I argue that we see a shift away from everyday resistance to the more broader national awakening. What we see happening here is that increasingly young Indonesians are openly resisting the Dutch performance of power, are openly resisting, just as Sumersono is doing. They are making it very clear through their clothes, through their language, through their gestures, that they're resisting colonialism, even though they're not part necessarily of a political movement, for instance. But this is in everyday life something that we see happening more and more. Here we have 2 scenes, or 2 chapters, if you will. One really focuses on the history of Sumersono himself, on the history of what is called the Hormat Circular in this particular moment of history. And I'll illustrate, or I'll talk more about what that means and what that is. But it deals with really the focus on all of these forms of obedience and deference that are increasingly come under attack by young Indonesians, not by the Dutch themselves, and they force change. This is perhaps most visible in clothing. And that's what the 4th chapter is about. And that's what the reference is here to the contestation of sartorial hierarchies. I mean, it's in clothing and in dress that we can really see this particular cultural struggle. After this change has been managed, I would argue, we get to the 3rd act of the colonial performance of power. And the 3rd act is really, in this case, there are 2 chapters where I deal with this. It's a question of forging modern identities. It's a question of, okay, so how do we communicate who we are, and how do we communicate that both to each other as well as to the colonizer? And both colonized and colonizer are both dealing with this question. So the Dutch are trying to increasingly wonder, what does it mean to be European or Dutch in Indonesia, as well as emerging group of Indonesians are wondering, what does it mean to be Indonesian or Javanese or Sundanese or Madurese in this particular context? And increasingly people are giving answers, and these answers are visible in things as consumer behavior, in terms of lifestyle choices, and in terms of other behavior outside in everyday encounters. And it's then in the everyday encounter that we can really study how this dynamic changes over time. And this is, for instance, visible in conversations about, like I already mentioned, consumer behavior, but also conversations about mixed marriages, right? Or about concubinage. And I deal with that in chapter 5. In chapter 6, I deal specifically with a specific site of the colonial encounter, which is the fairgrounds, places like the Pasar Gambir, for instance, in colonial Batavia, colonial Jakarta. And fairgrounds are really interesting because they are a really discursive place in colonial society where colonizer and colonized meet, and where we find a very active, engaging performance of power. All in all, the performance of power is then not just the Dutch imposition of power on Indonesians, it's also the negotiation and contestation thereof by Indonesians themselves. So it's a two-way process. So this is the book in a nutshell. And what I'd like to do I think I have probably about 15 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is tell you a bit more about some of these chapters by following the history of Sumbersono. And one way to do this is to begin, and it's kind of a reflection of the first chapter in the book, is if we want to understand why this Dutch resident or this Dutch assistant resident expects Sumbersono to crouch for him and to address him in High Javanese, we have to look at the 19th century. And in the first chapter, I explore how in the 19th century, the Dutch created a very deliberate policy of adapting Javanese deference traditions to legitimize colonial power. And this is kind of different from what a lot of scholarship has argued before. For instance, the late Benedict Anderson argued that the Javanization of Dutch authority was often a result more of the cohabitation of Europeans and indigenous women, resulting in the Eurasian element in Dutch colonial society. And it is through these relationships, he argued, that the Dutch became more and more familiar with Javanese culture. But as I demonstrate in this first chapter, is that alone is not sufficient explanation for what we see happening here. Instead, what we see happening in the 19th century is a very deliberate and intentional attempt of appropriation, of using Javanese traditions to legitimize colonial authority. And one example I'll just show you, there are many examples of this, right? And they're all detailed in strict regulations. The Dutch love writing down their regulations, and they love putting everything on paper and publishing it. One such regulation has to do with the payung as a symbol of power. And as all of you know, these are traditional symbols of power, specifically in the Javanese principalities. But what is interesting is the Dutch looked at this and they adapted it to their own means. So they actually designed, based on the Javanese principalities, their own payung hierarchy. And we can see that here on the left. These were payungs that were assigned to all colonial officials, all PI living or working for the Dutch, under the Dutch colonial authority. Of course, the highest color in this particular case is the gilded payung, the golden payung, and that was the privilege of the Dutch resident, who we see here on the right-hand side. And it's also the picture on the front cover of my book. And we can see here by putting the picture of the Bupati and the Dutch resident next to each other, kind of the similarities, the ways in which this Dutch official is trying to emulate this Dutch or this Javanese tradition of power, right? The payung itself symbolized Dutch colonial authority. So it's a very much a visual representation of how the Dutch tried to legitimize their power, their status in the eyes of the Javanese. And through this appropriation, made it almost appear that their power was natural and enduring, and that it was normal that the Dutch were in charge. Other elements of that we already mentioned. For instance, that Dutch officials expected to be addressed in High Javanese and they would respond in Low Javanese, but also that they would sit on chairs, whereas their Javanese servants would sit on the floor. All of these were very deliberate elements and they were all regulated on paper. So that's what the Javanization of colonial authority is. And I can talk much more about this also in the Q&A if you're interested. But this is kind of a really intriguing element of that larger history. And what is then really fascinating is that by the late 19th century, things start to change for various reasons that well, I don't have time to explain all of that in great detail because of the time, but for various reasons, by the late 19th century, there was a necessity on the part of the Dutch to begin to explain colonialism in a different way, to justify this in a different way. And this has to do with international developments, like the American control of the Philippines, the growing power of the French in Southeast Asia, but also larger thinking about the colonial enterprise. And this resulted in the pronunciation of the ethical policy in 1901. And the ethical policy, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, is basically a reference to what is often called the civilizing mission discourse. The assumption here is that the Dutch consider themselves to be superior, specifically technologically and scientifically. And with that superiority came a moral, basically, burden to uplift indigenous peoples. So it was a justification of empire, a justification for colonialism. Of course, with the assumption that it was almost impossible to uplift indigenous people. So this would be basically meant as a justification for empire in perpetuity. The ethical policy also then demanded a kind of a modernization, if you will, of colonial rule, which meant that colonial officials needed to modernize, needed to become more representable. So Dutch officials in the Netherlands and Dutch officials in Batavia, specifically the Governor General, and here we have Governor General van Hoyts, who is most famous, of course, for his leadership roles in the Aceh War in the late 19th century and the war crimes that the Dutch colonial army committed at the time in those 3 decades in Aceh. But when he was Governor General, as a reward for those war crimes in the early 20th century, he played a big role in trying to modernize the appearance of colonial authority. And we can see that in this particular cartoon here, where we see what he does with the payung. The payung needs to go as a symbol of Dutch authority. And it symbolizes an attempt, at least on colonial authorities, the high authorities, to get rid of these forms. They actually proclaim several circulars, the so-called Hormat circulars, that prohibit Dutch civil servants from demanding traditional deference from their Javanese colleagues. However, nobody listens. These circulars are basically ignored. They are ignored by European civil servants. They are ignored by the PIE themselves. And as a consequence, there is no real change. What is really interesting here is that what we see then is a moment in which there is this moment of hope. And this chapter then is also called in my book, Sweet Was the Dream, Bitter the Awakening. There are young Javanese who feel that something is changing, modernization is happening, but it's not really happening. And that creates incredible frustration, and also frustration with the Dutch leadership, because this change is not happening. And civil servants, like we've just met in the case of Bedding, are not changing. So that's what the second chapter deals with this modernization attempt, but it fails, it falls flat, and it leaves much to be desired. And that sets the stage for something new, something new. If change has to happen, it has to come from Indonesians themselves. And this brings us back to Sumarsono's story. And Sumarsono is a really interesting character who I encountered in the archives. And I want to emphasize, I use his story because I know so much about him through this archival research, because his story did play a big role in the narrative that I'm telling here. But it's important to emphasize that he was not alone, right? He was one among many in a generation who were using very similar tactics. But in the case of Sumarsono, just to give you some background, he was of PIE background. His grandfather was a bupati. His father was a public prosecutor. He therefore grew up. He was very familiar with Javanese aristocratic culture. He was a devout Muslim, but he was also fairly privileged. He actually had the ability to go to a Dutch secondary school in Jakarta, the Gymnasium Willem III, which was a very much an elite school where mostly Europeans and Eurasian students would go. When he applied in 1901, he was only 4 out of 148 applicants who was non-European. So he was only 4 of the non-European applicants out of 148 students. And he graduated in 1906 from this school. And at this school, he learned to speak fluent in Dutch. He always wore European clothes. He had many European friends. So this European atmosphere was where he felt really comfortable. When he served, or when he joined the civil service in 1906, he slowly but surely began his civil service career and rose through the ranks of the civil service. But he did so in the rather safe environment of Batavia. until 1913, that is, when he moved to Purwakarta. And here we then have a clash really of this what I call, this clash of kemajuan, progress, and tradition. And here that particular clash is then what we see happening between his European civil servant, who has all of these notions based in 19th century Javanization of colonial power, and Sumarsono, whose own ideas are much more modern, who is very much accustomed to being treated as an equal by his European friends, to speak Dutch, to sit on chairs. And that is a clash that we see happening. And that is precisely what makes this story so interesting. What we see happening next is something that happens not just to Sumarsono, to many others, but in the case of Sumarsono, something fascinating happens, and something begins to cascade. His relationship with his European superior deteriorates, but after a while, in May 1913, he gets this strange little short note from his European superior, in which it states, and in the book I have the whole quote that demonstrates this, that shows this, in which this European superior gives Sumarsono the very special privilege of sitting on a chair in his presence. And it's just a very short, curt note, but that at least momentarily resolves the tension, and Sumarsono returns to the police court. But there's something wrong between these two men. There's an incredible distrust. And that distrust only increases because Sumarsono is very much involved in a couple of other things as well. For instance, Sumarsono was a very early member of Budiotomo while he was living in Batavia. He was a close friend of people like Suwardi Suriningrat, Cipto Mangunkusumo, and he was also a founding member of the Sarekat Islam in Purwakarta. In fact, he became the driving force behind the local branch of the Sarekat Islam in Purwakarta during his time there as a civil servant, to the frustration of his European boss, who did not like his role in what he himself called association life at all. In May 1913, he actually gave a speech on the first 5-year anniversary of Budiotomo. And in that speech, Sumarsono made several big statements and big claims. But foremost, he really spoke to the people and argued that if you want to make change in your life and in your condition, you have to be the change. You cannot wait for other people to change your fate. It's up to you to make that change. And he compared the Javanese condition to basically to an oil lamp. He said, Islamic culture has provided us the wick, and Hindu Buddhist culture has provided us the lamp oil. The Dutch have provided us a lamp shade, but there's only one person or one people that can actually light the oil lamp, he argued, and that's us. We have to ignite change. And as an example of what igniting change could look like, how do you demand equality? He argued, you can change your clothes, you can change your outfit. And he told the people there, you can wear trousers, you can wear a European suit, you can wear shoes. And through this, you can demand to be treated as an equal by the Dutch. You can demand to sit on a chair. And he uses his own example here, his own personal experience with a confrontation of Bedding, he now uses to talk to the audience. When Bedding heard about this, he got incredibly upset and angry, and he complained to even the Governor General himself that he had this very unruly civil servant in his district, and he would rather get rid of him. The situation escalated quickly in July 1913, because in July 1913, Sumarsono actually did something else. He became involved with the distribution of a famous pamphlet, Als ik eens Nederlander was, a very famous pamphlet written by Suwardi Suriningrat, arguably one of the, I would really argue, one of the most eloquent accusations against Dutch colonialism or European colonialism in general, I would argue, written in the colonial era, that became incredibly sensitive. It saw Suwardi Suriningrat himself exiled, and the people that were distributing or helping distribute this pamphlet were basically put in under the spotlight of the authorities as well. So in this case, Bedding, the superior of Sumarsono, was incredibly upset with Sumarsono, and he wrote to the Governor General arguing that Sumarsono should be imprisoned, if not exiled, like Suwardi himself. And this set in motion a whole different chain of events. That is fascinating, and that really is the heart of the third chapter in my book. And I'll given the time, Wildan, do I have 5 more minutes, Wildan?
Oh, it's okay, Arnout, for 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to wrap up, but I'll finish this story and then I'll wrap up. So I'll have 5 more minutes. So essentially, what we see happening here now is this: all of these confrontations are coming to a head, and what happens is that Betting, or this is superior, wants to imprison Sumarsono. Sumarsono is angry, and he gets all the correspondence that he's collected from his encounters with Betting, and he sends it to the advisor for Native Affairs, Hasseu. He knows Hasseu from his own days in Batavia, where Hasseu was his mentor at high school. And Hasseu here is shocked by the experiences of Sumarsono, and he reads these letters, and he uses these letters to write to the Governor General. And he argues against the Governor General that if the Dutch will not intervene, if they will allow people like Sumarsono to be humiliated in this way, things will not end well for the Dutch in Indonesia. And this spurs the Governor General to proclaim another Hormat Circular, the Hormat Circular of 1913. And it's a very curious document. It's a document in which the Dutch colonial government acknowledges that its own civil servants are making mistakes, acknowledges that its own civil servants are fallible, in which it promises that it will be better, and in which it promises that civil servants are there for the people, not the other way around, and in which it actually encourages people like Sumarsono to come forth to the authorities and to tell people if civil servants are misbehaving. And this is a really curious, therefore it's a really curious moment in which Sumarsono's actions have a direct consequence in a document. And that's not all. What happens next is that this particular document is being used by the colonial authorities to demonstrate its own good intentions. For instance, I'm missing here. For instance, it uses this at Sarakat Islam meetings to proclaim the noble intentions of the Dutch government. And the document then becomes almost a call to enact social change through everyday resistance. Another very important moment, and given the time, I'm going a bit fast here, but another important moment is that this circular was originally written in Dutch, but people like Marco Cortolicomo, who is the editor of Dunia Bergerac, decided people need to read this also in their own language. So he published it in Malay, he published it in Bahasa, as you can see here in Dunia Bergerac. If you're interested in reading this either in Dutch or in Malay or in English, on my personal website, I have posted all 3 issues of the Hormat Circular. And there you can find this particular example from Dunia Bergerac as a PDF. You can download it and read it for yourself. It's a really intriguing document. I mean, it's very boring because it's a bureaucratic document, but if you read through the lines, it's a really intriguing document, and it encourages people to resist. What is then really fascinating is that this is precisely what we see happening. In September 1913, so not that long, the document the circular is announced in August 1913, but in September 1913, if you read through Indonesian newspapers, everywhere people are changing their appearance. The newspapers are full with little reports, long exposés of how pawn shop personnel or railroad personnel or people in the civil servants or teachers across Java are changing their clothing to demand change. It is such a big shift that somebody like Suwardi Suriningrat learns about this while he is exiled in the Netherlands at the time. And he calls this a great moment of sociological change. He recognizes that this is a really important moment in the history of Indonesia, and that people are now demanding equality by changing their clothes, by changing their attitudes. And we can kind of see that in this particular cartoon here. The Dutch were frustrated with this new attitude because it also meant that the Dutch themselves have to change their own appearance. Till this time, the Dutch were often wearing, at least in a private sphere, clothing that was inspired by Javanese dress, like sao and kabaya for European women, or a batik trousers for European men. But now they felt they could no longer do this because as Indonesians were wearing European clothes or a suit, Europeans could no longer leave behind. But with that also came a loss of respect in the Dutch imagination. And that's what this particular image demonstrates. What is so interesting then here too, there are dress circulars, in this case from 1905, that were also brought back in memory. So Marco Cortolicomo, for instance, in Dunia Bergerac also publishes the dress circular of 1905 in Malay in 1914 to remember people that they are allowed to wear European clothing, that the sartorial hierarchy of the 19th century, a time in which everybody was used to wear or basically forced to wear ethnic garb, was over. And so this is we see also the role of the vernacular press changing. This is a really empowering moment. So all of this leads to a new era, and I'll wrap up here, but a new era in which all of these forms of personal expression become really important in contesting colonial power, but also trying to formulate a vision for the future of Indonesia. So what does it mean to be modern? What does it mean to be Indonesian? How do we articulate that, both in terms of our clothes, in terms of our consumer behavior, in terms of our social norms, our social behavior? We can see this in all kinds of discussions, as I mentioned, discussions about, for instance, how do we think about the gender relationship between men and women? How do we think about going to movie theaters? What is appropriate? What is not? All of these things I discuss in chapter 5, and more specifically, with regards to the fairgrounds, I discuss these in, if the PowerPoint will work with me, in chapter 6. And I think I'll leave it here, and I'm sorry that I had to be a bit faster about the last 2 chapters. Oh, there we go, here, there we go. Chapter 6, staging and contesting modernity at the fairgrounds. So I'm sorry that at the end I had to go a little bit fast, but as in conclusion, I think what my research has tried to bring to the fore is really the importance of looking at everyday interactions and how it is often in everyday life that we have these moments of cultural resistance, and also ways in which authorities are trying to impose their particular power upon people. But it's there that we can find, I think, a really interesting moment of history, one from which we can which help us understand better how we can see political resistance emerge out of this foundation. So I'll leave it at that. And I welcome Pak Margana's response, and of course your questions after this. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Arnout, for your wonderful discussions, and I give it directly to Pak Margana. So we still have a lot of time to the rest of discussions. So please, Pak Margana, the time is yours.
You still unmute, Pak Margana.
Okay, thank you, Mas Wildan. First of all, I would like to congratulate Arnout van der Meer for producing such a very important research on the history of the colonial society in Java. I really enjoy reading every sentence of the book, although I haven't finished all of them. But it's impressed me a lot about any intriguing ideas that coming up in every chapter of the book. You have given very significant contribution to understanding how the colonial society works. And at the same time, the insecurity of the Dutch colonial authority in each phase of development, since the colonial state was founded in the beginning of the 19th centuries, until the critical period of their existence before the finally collapse, even before the Second World War was actually happened. And you try to examining the critical analysis by the Dutch colonial advisor. You start with this Hazu argument and how the Dutch colonial government and the indigenous rulers were drawn into what I call as an unexpected traps in what he calls an Oriental medieval state affairs. And then Arnout sees such an ambivalent hegemony in there. I do not really know whether your book version, how different between your dissertation and your book that is lately published by Cornell. But I hope what I have seen in your presentation, it seems there's nothing much different on it. So. And by seeing this Haiju statement and the concept that he introduced about the Oriental medieval state affairs, and then it was a question on the relationship between culture and power in colonial societies. And very interestingly, that Arnout adopting Gramsci concept on cultural hegemony, and then Arnout pursue representative material culture object that can be used as foundation of analysis. And then he turns to the daily life, looking at the ceremonial aspect, also dressing, and also other symbol that materialize in the material culture there. So it's very interesting, and actually there's a lot of object that can be used as a representation of this ambivalent hegemony, and how actually the Dutch was always in the position of uneasy in every step of the development of, actually since the beginning, by bringing up the ideology of civilizing society. At the same time, they need also to defend their own dignity as a colonial power. So it is really in the crossroads. At the same time, if they complete the civilizing, finishing the mission of civilizing indigenous people, but at the same time will be kind of boomerang that will back to hit them back in very front of their face, and it show in the very interesting example of Sumarsono, who one of the people who really challenged and contested to the government, to the colonial power, by showing his own characteristic and dressing up with like European official. And this also remind me also with the story of Ciptomangun Kusuma, who put the medal that given by the Dutch on his butt. So it's a kind of humiliation also for the Dutch. There's what I see here that I'm not really sure whether all aspect has been examined. I mean, there are a lot of space or places where the colonizer and the colonized encountered, and creating a kind of situation that how then the contestation has begun. And for instance, you focus on especially the elite, especially the relationship between elite, the Priai Baru, and the colonial rulers. But we also perhaps interesting to see what happened in the train, for instance, in the wagon of the train and the public transportation, and what happened when they enter into the bioscope, for instance, and how they put the position of the audience, of the watcher of the bioscope, how they put the class system, the first class and original ordinary class and something like that, how they put set up the position hierarchically in this kind of meeting encounters. There's also other places that we can examine, so not outside of this, or the what I call as a formal encounter, in the formal like ceremony, like in the officers, like the offices and the situation during the workplace. But we also find, for instance, on the street, for instance, in the how they encounter in the market, how they encounter in other space, and how this contestation took place. So also what interesting is that actually there's also a kind of effort for the local ruler, like for instance the king of Pakubuwono X, he tried to create to build a kind of football stadium in Solo, where you can you can show the encounter between the Dutch and also the indigenous people. They play in confrontation in the sport, and then the audience and the attendants who watch the football match, they also have a freedom to express what they feel, expressing their struggle on contesting their position, the social status in that time. So there's a certain space that created, that is it was planned really to show the contestation themselves. It's not something that happened because of circumstances, but there is also a kind of an ideas to create the place for the contestation themselves. So and then what I also interesting in this book is that and the adoptions. I mean the concept of the ambivalent themselves. At the same time, the Dutch also want to adopt the Japanese culture by, for instance, the very what is clear here in the adopting the parasol or payung to be part of the symbol of the Dutch, and to make people more obey, because perhaps they only understand that if you want to make the Japanese obey them, then you have to show this Japanese symbol of power, because and then they will become more become obeying what you want to do, and then you can do anything with that kind of symbol because it's part of their own power symbol in that time. So, but at the same time, then the Dutch also realized that this is a kind of humiliation, because it's not that the Dutch has own dignity, their own space, their own authority, that they have their own way of showing the power. It should not be like that, because this is put you at the lower level of the indigenous people in that time. So this is something that very intriguing ideas, also thing that they have done. And perhaps what I want to question to Arnout is that about the function of Hazu, and how much the Hazu as a colonial advisor has influenced the government in taking taking a step or make a kind of policy, for instance, allowing people, indigenous people, wearing European suit or European dress, something like that. And I see that it seemed that the role of the advisor is very, very important in this changing of policy, of the Dutch policy in that time. Also, if we mention about the ethical policy that has been debated before they could be really implemented in the beginning of the 20th century, it seemed that against the role of the advisors, of the colonial advisor, are very important here. They are really somebody behind all this kind of the policy that has been taken by the Dutch government at that time. And I'm also interested to see how was the reason of the Dutch government reinvited Hazu to come back to the Netherlands, to the Netherlands Indies, to give more advice to the government about it. I know that there was intensive the increasing role of the nationalist movement in Indonesia, but surprisingly that Hazu advice was not really encounter with the real issue about the political movement, but he thought something that's more symbolic thing by addressing the attitude of the government themselves and not really focusing on the the demand of the movement about whether it's about the equality of the democratization of the government and the equality of economic life, and also other things that really announced by the activists of the national movement. But interestingly, that Hasu coming up to the more to the attitude, more to the lifestyle, more to the to the culture of the government in that time. So this is just something that I very intriguing that I can that I could find in your very interesting book, and finally I really want to say again congratulations for the book. I hope the book can be soon be reading by Indonesian widely in Indonesian language, translated in Indonesian in Bahasa. So your interesting book can be more widely read. Okay, that's what I can say, Mas Wildan. Perhaps
Okay.
Arnout has something to say about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Pak Margana, for your comments, very detailed comment and precise questions. And Arnout, so please to replies comments and questions from Pak Margana.
Well, first of all, Pak Margana, thank you so much for your kind words. I really appreciate it, and yeah, and thanks for your careful reading of my work. It's it's always such a pleasure when that happens, right? When you can actually have somebody engage with your scholarship, and in this case, I think you bring up a lot of really interesting points, and so I'll talk first about the more specific questions that you posed at the end, and then I'll make some more general comments on some of the things you brought up. But the role of the advisor for Native affairs, as it translated in English, was a really interesting one, but also I would say a paradoxical one in the colonial period, because it begins with sort of the person before Hasu, of course, is with horrible name of Snoekhorgonje, which is probably a name that most historians here will know, but he was officially the first advisor for Native affairs. But he himself has this very complex history of just as Van Heuts, who already mentioned, being very complicit in the horrors of the Aceh War, but at the same time, then he becomes a mentor to the young Javanese when he is back in Java. So again, we have a very complicated figure here who becomes also really important in the study of Islam, for instance, and the pilgrimage to Mecca. So this is a person with, on the one hand, great affinity to Javanese culture and society, but on the other hand, also very much is a colonial agent, right? An agent of the colonial state. But I think what you do find in his writings, and later also in Hasu, who is the person who comes after him, is that, so while on the one hand, they are agents of the state and their prime interest, and I think we should never forget that when we're reading their materials, still their prime interest is colonialism, right? So they are still there to support the colonial state. They're not advocates for independence, right? Just to give, I think it's really important for us to kind of to foreground that. However, they have great affinity for the young Javanese, especially. Both of them are very involved in education, in the education of the young Javanese. Snoekhorgonje is a great example here, but Hasu himself, he is a teacher at the high school that Sumarsono attended for a little while, and that's where they two meet, that's how they know each other. And here there grows this relationship, and I think in part it's these personal relationships that kind of explain, I think, Hasu's frustration with the treatment of the young Javanese. He feels that they are being mistreated, and he feels that there's no harm done, if you will, by Dutch authorities to treat them more as equals. Again, Hasu's concern, if you're a cynic, is that if the Dutch authorities don't address these issues, it will result into an anti-colonial movement. So his concern is we need to address these tensions before they get out of hand. And I didn't have time, but I can, let's see where I have them. I can read you here, just as a sense of it. But in 1913, Hasseu writes, for instance, he increasingly feared, and I quote, serious consequences if the culture within the civil service was not modernized, as the Javanese, and I quote again, no longer tolerate these humiliations as they used to, end quote. And it's clear to me that Hasseu he's sympathetic, but he's also arguing if it's these small things, there's these small vexations, right, about different clothes, different language. If we don't address this issue, things can get out of hand. Right. This is really, so I think in a strange way, it's his writing and his thinking that point me to these everyday forms of resistance, because that's where Hasseu is looking. That's important, he says, right? It's not, we shouldn't be afraid necessarily of the Sarakat Islam. This is what we should be afraid of, because if we don't address this, then we're going to lose this larger struggle. So I hope that kind of addresses the question of Hasseu and the advisors. I mean, the advisors, they are, at least until the early 1920s, they are, I do think to an extent, they are allies. They are persons of who people in the nationalist movement trust. But to give you an example, Hasseu is a complicated figure too. It's under Hasseu's guidance that the colonial authorities refuse to accept the Sarakat Islam, right, as a national-led organization, but rather they promote a fragmented organization with local branches. With the Purakarta Sarakat Islam is a great example, right? The one that Sumarsono actually helped create. So here we are, again, we see that dubious role, even in a figure like Hasseu, who was, again, a great affinity for Javanese culture, but he was an agent of the colonial state. So I think, and then, so I think, I hope, Pak Margana, that kind of answers the way of the positions of what is interesting is that Hasseu, in taking this difficult position, actually loses favor by the late 1910s among colonial officials and colonial civil servants. So when by the late 1910s, the Sarakat Islam grows much more powerful, much more politically prevalent, he's actually sent off home, especially after the murder of Dutch officials in Toli Toli, in I think that's 1918 on the top of my head, or 1919. You have the there's the several affair, the Garut affair as well, and that this is basically means the end of Hasseu, and it means the end of an important role of these advisors. I've also found that the archives of the advisors become less interesting in the 1920s because they're less insightful. The other thing that you brought up, in terms of thinking about space, I love that example of the soccer match. I think that's absolutely, that's a wonderful example, because I can imagine how the audience suddenly has this freedom to express themselves and to express their allegiance and to express their support. I think that's a wonderful example. The Court of Solo is interesting, and it's in many other ways too. Already in 1904, the Court of Solo actually prohibited for use there a lot of these more traditional forms of deference at the court. So they were front runners in that respect too. So it's kind of interesting that here too, the Pakubuwono X already with the soccer match was doing something very similar. Mm-hmm. But you brought up all of these interesting examples of trains, for instance, and trains also feature in my chapter on dress. There's one part that I didn't include in the chapter on dress, which is interesting with trains, is that up until 1913, train stations and trains were, the class system in trains was based on ethnicity. So were you European, Eurasian, Javanese? But in 1913, there's a change, and it stipulates that the change is going to be made more on what ticket can you purchase, one. So it depends on your finances and your appearance. So if you want to travel first class, you can, if you can afford it, and if you wear modern European clothes. And this is a kind of a really interesting thing that begins to happen in late colonial Indonesia, where it is possible for wealthy Indonesians, if they are dressed like Europeans, to participate in some of these first class events, also at movie theaters. The same goes for European restaurants. So it's kind of an interesting how class and race are entangled with one another in this period. You can see the same with the fairgrounds, right? The Pasar Gambir, for instance, where there are different entry prices. A lot of people don't realize this, but Europeans would say they would pay 50 cents. Then the category of foreign Easterners, which mostly would be the Chinese, they will pay 25 cents, and then Indonesians will pay 15 cents. However, within the fairgrounds, there will be restaurants like European restaurants, Indonesian restaurants, Chinese restaurants. And if Indonesians could afford to eat at the European restaurant, they were allowed to eat there. But again, if they were dressed in modern fashion. And it's these gray areas that I find really interesting to study, I think, because there's a lot of fascinating things that are happening right there. So there are, what that also does is it kind of challenges some of our notions of late colonial Indonesia as an apartheid regime, where the racial boundaries were very clear and very strict. But the reality is that they were a little bit, they were permeable, right? And that of course has to do with the very large, until the late era of colonialism, the very large presence of the Eurasian community within the Dutch community. So as I write, I think in my book, talking about clothing, one of the reasons why clothing is so important in Indonesia is because skin color does not necessarily equate social status, right? There are a lot of people with European status, but who don't look necessarily European, but their clothing signifies their European status. So it's a very ambiguous discursive space. Yeah. So I hope, Pak Margana, that addresses some of your issues, and I'm more than happy to field more questions.
Give the chance to others.
Okay, thank you, Arnout, for your response to Pak Margana. And now I think we can continue to the Q&A session. So first of all, I will open for 3 participants to give questions or comments to Arnout's book. So please, anyone who want to questions or give comments, to raise hand, or you can also probably write in the chat box, but I prefer to you to raise your hand.
I think Pak Joko want to ask.
Oh ya, Pak Joko.
Ya, terima kasih banyak, Mas Wildan. Terima kasih banyak. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to appreciate, congratulations to Arnout for his book Performing Power. What I was to ask you is first, why the cultural, Dutch culture in Europe is far different within Indonesia. As far as I know, that culture in Europe is very, very tolerant, modest, and so on. But why in Indonesia, hegemony, something like that? As far as I know, that Anthony Gramsci actually not only said about hegemony, but also the domination. Actually, as far as I know, that the Dutch culture is in Indonesia not only hegemony, but also the domination. This is the first question. The second question is, I would like also to suggest you that your book should be translated in Indonesia. This is a very important book, and we would like that this book would be translated Indonesian. Yeah, thank you very much. That is my question.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Joko. Others, or you want to direct answer Arnout, or you wrap up?
Yes,
you wrap up the questions.
Better. Yes, please.
Yeah, I can answer right now. Yeah. Thank you, Pak Utomo, for these questions. They're really wonderful questions. And I think one of the big contradictions about colonialism in general is, of course, that you have these European countries like the Dutch, the Netherlands, who are in Europe proclaiming democracy, who are in Europe proclaiming freedom, who are in Europe arguing for free markets, free labor. And of course, then abroad, they are authoritarian regimes, they're dictatorships, they are based on coerced labor and coerced labor systems. It's the complete opposite, right? So the rhetoric at home does not match the rhetoric abroad. And we see that everywhere. We see that the same, of course, with English and the French, and it's all across the board. And what is, of course, called the ethical policy in Indonesia. It's called the civilizing mission in British India. It's called the white man's burden in the Philippines. It's called the mission civilisatrice in Indochina. So this is a wider phenomenon. And the reason, of course, is that there, especially with the civilizing mission discourse, on the one hand, there is this argument about, well, we have this moral obligation to uplift people who are allegedly inferior. But at the same time, the Dutch also believe, based on their racist ideas, based on social Darwinism and eugenics, they also believe that that's impossible. So there's, again, a paradox here at work. And what we then have is rhetoric, it's discourse. It's the discourse itself is a tool of power, I would argue. And with regard to Gramsci, and I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the things that I make this clear in the introduction, I don't believe that the Dutch ever attained hegemony in Indonesia. So it's important. So kind of to give an idea here, the concept of one of the big innovations of Gramsci was to think about the dynamic of power could be in various forms, almost on a spectrum. And on one end of that spectrum is always coercion, is power, the actual political domination of people. And we could think about police and army and other forms of actual brute force, brute power. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum is when you have people buy into their own submission. So when people buy into this particular narrative that that they accept the situation as they is, so that they buy into the current circumstances, the social circumstances, and that's what he calls hegemony. And I imagine that it's a spectrum, right? So you can kind of be a society can be on that spectrum. You could be closer to open oppression. You could be closer to hegemony. Other historians have demonstrated, there's a lot of history being done in British India, for instance, and a lot of British Indian historians historians of British India have used hegemony to study British India, and there they have already concluded that colonialism was, and these are the words of historian Guha, not my words, but he and I quote says, colonialism is dominance without hegemony. And I think that's a good good characterization. But what Gramsci does offer us is a window into how a colonial power might try to legitimize power in everyday life without having to resort to violence all the time. So I'm more interested in the attempt at doing this, right? The attempt at being more hegemonic, but at the same time being very much aware that some of the reason why there might be appearance of it working is simply because of the power that's still there, right? It's still the colonial army or the police force or the collaboration, of course, of the PI, which is also important in this moment. And it's this power that makes it possible. So Gramsci is a window for me to study these everyday interactions, these attempts at the performance of power. But it never really works. And that's also really important to say, because that means that we always have resistance, right? And we see that in these everyday moments. So I hope Pakutomo, that answers your question.
Yes, one more question. Actually, I like, yes.
Brief questions,
how do you think about, ya Mas Wildan, satu lagi tadi kelupaan saya.
Ya, singkat,
saya
Pak.
mau tanya ini ya, kepada Arnout ini ya. How do you think about the book written by Francis Hauda, that culture overseas? Thank you.
Yeah, strange enough, I've never met Francis Hauda, which is interesting. I've communicated with her via email, but I've actually never met her in person. This book came out quite some time ago, and I thought it, to an extent for me, it was inspirational at the time. I thought it was very interesting. It was very, she too approaches, colonialism much more from the cultural perspective. She too is really interested in culture. Other book that I found, or other scholars that I found really important, Rudolf Mrazek, I think he too writes very similar histories, or Takashi Shirayashi's work, of an age in motion. I think those are all the works that I really look at, and yeah. So and also, of course, also Jean Gelman Taylor's work, The Social World of Batavia, is really important here too, because it also has this focus on culture. But Frances Gouda's book, to your point, I think she really explains well how this Dutch discourse works, right? So the discourse of colonialism, and how the Dutch try to legitimize colonialism, right? The civilizing mission discourse. Because she really explains also the importance of evolutionary biology, for instance, in a way that the Dutch try to make sense of what's happening. So yeah, so I know the study well, and it's been an inspiration.
Okay, thank you. Terima kasih Mas Wildan. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Joko and Arnout. So, anyone, 80 people that presents here. Oh yeah, Sailal, Pak Sailal Arimi, please.
Thank you, Mas Wildan. My name is Sailal Arimi, Pak Arnout. Congratulations for your book. Actually, I work for the Department of Bahasa and Sastra, not from the history department, but the title of your book is very interesting, because talking about hegemony, identity, and resistance is also mostly discussed in social linguistics. One of my field my enterprise. Even though I don't read your book yet, but from the discussions, and also Pak Margana discuss about the book, it seems to me that your book is very important and interesting. Talking about power, actually, we know the definitions of power is the force to control, right? The action or thought of others, either it is individual or institution, right? So our question is, who is the self, and who is the other there? Yeah, you talk about the power there before 1913 and 1920, 21, and so. As we know, the discourse of Indonesia, actually I like to put colonized Indonesia rather than colonial Indonesia. The discourse of Indonesia existed in 1928, when the youth fledged. But before that, the formal identity of Indonesia was not called Indonesia, but Hindia Belanda. And Indonesia formally really existed in 1945 after the proclaim of Indonesia, independence of Indonesia, right? When you put the statement on the title of your book, Performing Power, in the book, the question is whose power? Yeah, who take place the self and the other? Indonesia before 1928 is like a sort of like we say divisive Hindia Belanda. Yeah, we cannot say Indonesia as a whole, right? Maybe about Sundanese or Javanese. Okay, this is the first question. And the second question, it seems to me like I'm very interested in your conclusion, but I never get the conclusion yet because maybe the limited time. But how would you formulate the cultural hegemony and identity? It is, I think, it is a big job. How do you formulate the hegemony and identity in your book? Thank you very much for that question.
Terima kasih Pak Sailal. Arnout, please.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. And you're absolutely right. I think one of the interesting parts, of course, of this history is that it is actually, I'm studying a period through which the concept or the idea of Indonesia is being born, really, right? So this is something that develops throughout this study. In terms of power, the self and the other, what is so interesting, as I start out with that case study that I mentioned today, initially you would think that this is all about, Dutch power, this imposition of Dutch power, right? And it's basically a Dutch attempt, right? They're trying what we might call the hegemonic script. These ideas are loosely based or loosely informed by the work of James Scott. You might be familiar with the works of James Scott. And James Scott called this what he calls the public transcript, right? So this is a Dutch attempt of writing this public transcript to legitimize their power. But as I point out, there's also as he calls it, a hidden transcript, which is written by, in this case, the colonized, by the Indonesians. That is their response to that transcript. And the performance is then how these two things meet, where they meet and how they interact. And so in many ways, performing power is a performance of both. I think, I hope, at least in my book, that the agents of this performance are both the colonizer and the colonized. So the self and the other, it's actually pretty difficult to say. I mean, the Dutch are perhaps seen as the self initially, but actually throughout the book, it becomes much more complicated, and it demonstrates that this is it's almost like, I don't know, perhaps this is a very strange analogy, but it's almost like a dance. It's very much a performance that requires two players. And that's, I hope, that the book demonstrates. The other, so I hope that kind of answers your question on the self and the other. In terms of the notion of Indonesia, you're absolutely right that this is, the Youth Pledge of 1928 is really important here. What I try to demonstrate is that initially a lot of these forms of resistance are more focused on Javanese identity, or if you are, let's say, more closer to Western Java, about Sundanese identity. And we see this too in organizations, right? A lot of these early organizations are youth parties or youth movements, which are focused more on ethnic identities. But by the 1920s, this starts to shift. So in the 1920s, increasingly, I see this question about what does it mean to be Indonesian? For instance, in the chapter about clothing, increasingly that question doesn't become what does it mean to be or to wear Javanese clothes or Javanese dress. The question literally becomes, what does it mean to wear Indonesian clothes? What does an Indonesian person looks like? What does an Indonesian man look like? What does an Indonesian woman look like? And those discussions, so you can kind of see it develop over time into from these more ethnically based discussions to a more national based discussion. And I do think that changes, again, the performance of power, right? This dynamic where it becomes a much more powerful dynamic. But it's an interesting one to follow, because with that too, you also find that there's a lot of controversy about what that means, what it means to be Indonesian, for instance, right? That answer is not the same. And so, of course, most famously, we see, big currents, some groups argue Islamic identity is much more prevalent. Others argue for a more nationalist identity. And then, of course, we have others who argue much more for a political ideology, such as socialism or communism, as the basis of this newfound identity. And all of these things we see back in these conversations about appearance and clothing and behavior, and so I at least I hope that's what my book shows. But I think that's what I see when I read through these newspapers. It's this is not a clear-cut singular narrative. And then I just make sure that I understood your final question correctly on hegemony and identity. It's more of how I see that in the book, if that's correct, or
the second question.
Yes, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, simply how do you formulate the cultural hegemony and identity on your book? Because I don't see the conclusions. I just.
Okay. So for me, this is really about so cultural hegemony is really a reference to this attempt on the part of the Dutch to attain hegemony, right? So the various ways in which they try to do this. But also the role that identity formation plays in this. So it goes in two ways here. It's the identity that the Dutch are trying to create for themselves to legitimize authority, to achieve hegemony. But at the same time, it's also the identity that the colonized, in this case, Javanese, Sundanese, but eventually what we call Indonesians are using to identify themselves to create a counter-hegemony, if you will, a counter-hegemonic narrative. So it refers to, for me, to both sides of this paradigm. So it's very much again, it's an active narrative for me. And that being said, I almost forgot, I wrote this down because I thought, I agree. I don't know why I never thought of this before, but I love your idea of speaking of colonized rather than colonial. So thank you for sharing that. I think that's it's a very, I think it's a very relevant distinction. So, and I hadn't thought about it before. So I wrote it down, and I'm probably gonna use it, but I'll think of you. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arnout.
Okay, yeah, okay, Arnout. I think there is one question through the chat box, so I read for you, Arnout. So, Dr. Arnout, can you mention again the discourse on evolutionary biology that legitimized the civilizing missions discourse? So because Pradipa missed the discussions on that matter. Please, Arnout, you still mute.
Yeah, so I'll write it in the chat box. So the book that that was triggered by was called Dutch Culture Overseas by Francis Gouda. There is another book that deals specifically with, and it was on the top of my head, I forgot the title. The author names is, I think, Fanneke Siesling, and she wrote another book. I'll look it up. That's easy of being in the office. Oh yeah, racial science and human diversity in colonial Indonesia. That's another book that deals with the same question. So that might be interesting in colonial Indonesia. And again, colonial, not colonized. It's interesting. So that's another book. So these two books deal with that question of evolutionary biology and its relationship to colonial discourse.
Okay, Arnout. Next, Mas Wahid.
Okay, thank you, Wildan. Well, I not just want to continue the discussion, perhaps. From Indonesian side perspective, because this period is also very important, and the new education's elites that was born in that period, they are very much how you call it, engage and dream of actually the so-called kemajuan, the idea of progress. So, and this is very important. But then, although we can also say that the new educated people still very much come from the highest level of society, from the elite. So it's still limited the time. But what I want to say is just, this discourse of colonial hegemony, perhaps the focus of your book is very much about the Japanese elite or the Japanese society. But the idea of progress is also shared by, for example, Chinese, Arab, and then the other ethnic communities, and they share some dreams of becoming like a part of this colonial modernity or whatever, in which the Dutch has visions perhaps about it, and has projecting a certain type of modernity to be introduced in colonized Indonesia. So I'm just wondering to what extent, for example, this discourse about the cultural hegemony or resistance also involving other non-Javanese or elite at the time, for example, Chinese and Arab, etc., etc. That's my first question. And the second question, I'm thinking about another aspect of this period, that in the same time, actually, it seems that the projecting modernity by the colonial government to many extents were institutionalized internal structure or internal hierarchies within Indonesian society at the time, and it has a very long impact actually, because now we say that, okay, only the higher Japanese language, for example, on language, in Sundanese as well. So the so-called the Japanese or Sundanese language is very much those who are or who were recognized by the colonial government. So only certain type of local language. So I mean, this is another aspect of consequences perhaps of this cultural hegemony that I'm not really sure if you touch upon it, or maybe that's the next agenda of your research perhaps. And last thing, I think maybe I don't know. I don't really remember if I really raised this question also to you when in Leiden in Keitel. So we miss the gender aspect, in this discussion. How actually this cultural hegemony maybe concern or maybe take aboard the idea of educating the women or their position in society. How this the colonial government at the time projecting the positions of women at that time. Well, but that's a few things that I just want to add, maybe to make the discussion more lively, perhaps. Thank you, Arnout.
Great questions, Mas Wahid. Please, Arnout, for replies.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's thank you, Pak. Those are wonderful questions, and so the first kind of point about colonial modernity and how it's shared with. You're absolutely right. This is the. Of course, this doesn't happen in isolation with the Chinese and sort of the smaller Arab community as well. What is interesting, it doesn't feature as prominently in my book what happens with these. Although there are important moments where I do talk about what happens with the sort of the Chinese community within Indonesia, because they are part of this conversation, right? So they are part of this dynamic. For instance, it's the Chinese who are first to shed their clothes. Right, who are first to embrace modern clothing and to signify their new social status through this. In a chapter about clothing, I specifically talk, for instance, about how the rise of Japan is really important in all of this in the background, because it kind of demonstrates that, here you have this really powerful and modern country. The Japanese themselves also embrace Western clothing. This kind of triggers a response by the Chinese minority in Indonesia, who are kind of modeling themselves after the Japanese, and they're demanding the same rights as the Japanese get. So in 1898, as some of you might know, the Japanese get equal rights to Europeans in colonial Indonesia. They are essentially become legally Europeans. And that really promotes the Chinese movement in Indonesia. And then the Chinese success in their movement promotes kind of reacts or demands the reaction from the Javanese, right? And actually becomes really important for association like Budi Utomo, which becomes inspired by this. And we can see that even in the speech of Sumarsono that I mentioned before. In his speech, he says that it's not just about, do you want to demand equality from the Dutch? He also says, do you want equality from the Chinese? Right, so his focus is not just about competition within society with the Dutch, it's also about competition with the Chinese. And that's, of course, very much in line with the history of the Sarekat Islam, which too is focused also very much against the Peranakan Chinese community. So I think you could write a much more broader history, Pak Wahid, you're absolutely right, in which this is much more deeply explored, and you can then incorporate other communities too, such as kind of the Arab community as well, which is a smaller community. But this is not just, of course, limited to in this particular case, let's say Indonesians and the Dutch. That's much broader. But each of these communities is trying to articulate new identities, trying to negotiate their social status within this society. And I think that's what we can study by looking at this. So there are elements of this in the book, but not as detailed as is possible. So there's more work to be done. With regards to that element of Javanese culture, and maybe I'm if I understood you right, the question is more like how that kind of maintains, right? Like how that stays, right? These traditions, yes. So what is interesting here, I had to think about John Pemberton's book on Java and Javanese culture and history. And in that book, he makes the book is just called On Java, I believe, just on the top of my head, On Java. And
The subject of Java.
the subject, yeah, so yes, thank you, the subject of Java. And one of the arguments that he makes, and I make the same argument in my book with reference to him, is that the problem with there are many problems with colonialism, but one problem with colonialism is that it tries to create very static hierarchies. So in the 19th century, through all these regulations that I already mentioned, the Dutch tried to present Javanese culture and identity as very static, as something that is almost frozen in time, right? And as such, right, if it is frozen in time, you know, it strengthens the Dutch argument that they are there to develop, but also it strengthens the argument of embracing these cultural elements to legitimize their power. And Pemberton then argues that it's actually in response that the Javanese elite, in response to this notion of being frozen in time, that they begin to articulate a much more stringent interpretation of their own culture. So that it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy almost of creating a culture that is much less dynamic and much more rigid. So perhaps that has something to do with this. Although, of course, I would argue in the 1910s and 1920s, there's a very strong counter push against this. So that will be something to really look into, kind of like how that, you know, translates into what happens in you know, the independence era. And gender, I mean, you know, gender is not the main focus, you know, not one of the main focuses of my study, but there is a lot of reference to it in each chapter, especially the last 3 chapters. So from chapter 4, 5, and 6, there are a lot of references to gender and the roles that gender play in this, because women and their bodies and their position are really important in these conversations about identity. For instance, in terms of clothing, the chapter on clothing discuss how initially women are able, also Indonesian women are able to dress more freely. In the 1910s, they also begin to experiment with wearing, let's say, European clothes. But very quickly, there is a division between what Indonesian men and women can do and wear. So increasingly, Indonesian men are able to wear Western suits, Western trousers, for instance. The sarong or kain is seen as very feminine, so kind of borrowing European notions of femininity and masculinity. But increasingly then women are positioned as guardians of traditional culture, and for them is then you know, the traditional clothes become much more stringent. So that's something that we see happening in the 1920s, and that actually gets even further strengthened if you read through women's magazines from, you know, especially Islamic organizations, increasingly concerns about what is proper behavior, you know, proper you know, sexual behavior, proper behavior in terms of social engagements, of clothing, of consumption, consumer behavior. And I can see this too very much in the conversation on colonial affairs, for instance, in chapter 6. And one of the, you know, interesting things in chapter 6 that is new in the book. So I wrote an article, as some of you might know, on colonial affairs, which is published. But the chapter 6 has an additional 10 pages in which there's more information on fairs. And one of those really interesting things is that the study club of Surabaya actually tried to found their own fair as a response to Dutch colonial fairs. And one of the reasons they created this own fairground in Surabaya was to create a safe space for Indonesian women. This needed to be a space free of Western influences that could be corrupting, free from influences that were deemed dangerous for Indonesian women. And that's one of the main driving forces behind the organization of this fair, which was organized, so it's a Pasar Malam Nasional, and it was organized for about 3 years, very successfully, drawing more than 100,000 visitors in these years. And it's kind of a really fascinating history. And in chapter 5 of the book, I deal specifically with the conversation of mixed marriage and concubinage. And here too, it's really interesting to kind of see how these conversations where gender kind of features here in terms of identity. So initially, the Indonesian nationalist movement really agitates against the system of concubinage, against mixed marriage between European men and Dutch women. And then they actually celebrate the marriage of European women and Indonesian men, also as a way of countering, right, this Dutch narrative. And that changes in the 1920s. In the 1920s, there's a much more rigid identity that emerges, stating that actually also Indonesian men should no longer marry or have relationships with European women. And of course, this is leads to fierce discussions in the vernacular press, for instance. Most famously is the example, perhaps, of Sutomo, who, of course, has as some of you might know, a European wife. But in the 1930s, the vernacular press, the Indonesian press, actually really questions his loyalty to Indonesia because he married a European woman. It's something that really bothered him, right? It was a personal affront to him, but it does really show how the thinking about mixed marriages and these relationships changes over time. So that's a longer response, and I hope that kind of addresses your questions, Pak Wahid.
Okay, thank you, Arnout. There's another question through the chat box by Bu Fatia Nadia. I would like to ask about the relations between political identity, especially socialist, nationalist, and communist identity, is related with the resistance against the Dutch colonial. And the second question, she's agreed with Pak Wahid. What is the impact of the Dutch colonial on women? So please, Arnout.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions, Nadia. I really appreciate them. And so this is really fascinating in terms of the so for the first question, the relation between political identity, especially socialist. One of the ways in which I deal with this is that we see that, and that is not a surprise to most of you, is that each of these groups begins to articulate different responses to Dutch hegemony, or at least to the Dutch attempts at hegemony. They begin to devise different identities for themselves. So they devise different clothing regimens, they devise different social regimens, they devise different consumer regimens that are a reflection of their political status. But we can see in those forms that their everyday resistance takes their own political situation in Indonesia. So it's important to not, so one of the things that I try to do in my later chapters is to really clarify that it's important to also understand, let's say, which newspaper are you reading? What is the political association of that newspaper? And then look at, for instance, what is the position on clothing in this particular newspaper? And is it different from, let's say, women's magazine on clothing, or is it different than an Islamic magazine on clothing? And oftentimes it is. You see very different attitudes to these issues. So we see that each of these groups are, it's not uniform, right? This resistance is very broad, but it's not a unified anti-colonial resistance. It is a very diversified anti-colonial resistance. And I think that's really important for us to articulate, that this notion of the national awakening is not a singular national awakening, but it's a, I think it's better to speak of the national awakening in the plural. We see different national awakenings also in this struggle. One of course really intriguing example in terms of, for instance, actually an ambition shared by both nationalist and communist ones, is increasingly in terms of consumerism in the 1930s, there is this increasing desire to only consume local products. And this is, for instance, inspired by the Swadeshi movement, which Mahatma Gandhi has triggered in British India. And this particular iteration in Indonesia basically argues that its members should only buy local produced products, right? Locally produced clothing, or locally produced soap, or locally produced food. And it becomes kind of a articulation of, through your consumer behavior, you're supporting the nationalist cause. So that could serve as one particular example of this. And I think I already addressed the situation of women in my answer to Pak Wahid. I'm unfamiliar with the particular demonstration that you mentioned from 1926, so I would love to learn more about it. But what is really interesting, of course, is I did look at the women's conference, I think 1928 women's conference, and there too we have very clear articulations of kind of the new imagined women's role in society. And this is where we can see kind of this more notion of Indonesian women as the guardian of tradition, as the guardian of national culture and identity. And that has its own impact, again, on how women are then participating in this performance of power. So I hope that kind of addresses your question, but I'm more than happy to go into more detail if you'd like.
Okay, thank you, Arnold. Perhaps one questions more, because we should end on the 11th. Okay, one questions. Anyone? Please raise your hands. If there is no question, can I answer also, Arnold? Just one brief questions. How do you read the cultural resistance carried out by the Japanese elites through the archives? Because we know that these archives were written from the colonial perspective, and how to against the grain capture the aspirations of these Japanese elites, modernists in the colonial archives. Is it still possible, or we should look entirely to the Indonesian newspapers or magazines?
Yeah, it's as they say here in the United States, it's $1 million question, right? Of this particular research. So I think there's two big strategies that I've used and that everybody could use. One is indeed reading against the grain. So really kind of see, like you're reading, like if you read these colonial reports, oftentimes they are like, if a lot of these reports, let's say, deal with people are changing their outfit, their clothing, right? It tells us something about what the colonizer is concerned about, right? So it tells us, right, it learns us to read these against the grain, and from that we can actually make deductions. But I do think that the Indonesian newspapers are a really important source for our research, because especially in the early kind of period here, we have very few written sources, and we need those sources to really reconstruct these larger narratives. The problem, and I was speaking about this with Pak Margana and Pak Wahid right before this meeting, is that these newspapers are scattered, right? We have of course a beautiful library in Jogja, but also in Jakarta, but a lot of these publications are also in Leiden or in here in the United States in libraries. So it's sometimes hard to find them. The way that I have used to approach this is by reading Dutch censorship reports. So the Dutch colonial government created censorship reports, which are now all freely available through a website called delver.com. Some of you might know it. I can type it in a box. It's basically the Dutch Royal Library, probably, or Delver. And it's where you can look for the press overviews of this particular censorship reports. And the great thing, the unfortunate thing, of course, is that these reports are in Dutch. But what I've done, I've used those reports to basically scan for information on, let's say, newspaper reports on clothing. And I would take that and then look for the original newspaper. So, for instance, this newspaper that would say, in the Bintang Timur of June 1929, there's this particular article. So what I would do with that few sentences is I would then find the original document, so the Bintang Timur, and I would then read the whole article. And that would often read to more other references to other articles published in the same week. And then you can actually also look at, okay, this is what the colonial government writes, and this is what the actual article states. And then you can kind of do some discourse analysis and say, okay, so where are they the same? Where are they different? So that's where I think it's a lot of work needs to be done, or it can be done there. Of course, the problem is that the best way to search these papers is then through these Dutch sources, which is kind of a real issue. But through at least Delver, you can use their OCR, right? They're text searchable. So that's actually a really cool way of doing that. But I know I'm pretty confident that Pak Wahid knows this already, and any students who are interested in that could ask him and others to show him how it's done. But I'm more than happy to share more information about this if people are interested.
Okay, thank you, Arnout, for your replies. I think some students of us have used the Delver NL, and it's very beneficial for us to access that through online. And I think we should stop here because it is not very wise to continue beyond 11s because Arnout is in the US and it will be very late, very, very late and midnight. I think Arnout should take a rest. On the contrary, we are still in the fuel energy because it's still afternoon. So I think thank you for the lively discussions, very dynamic discussions today, and thank you for all of the participants who present here. And once again, congratulations, Arnout, for publishing this book. I think this research is important because it changed our perspective so that we don't forget the everyday cultural resistance of Indonesians through cultural performance and contestations instead of always focusing on organizations, political movements, and demonstrations. And I agree with some people in here. I hope the Indonesian publishers are interested to translate this book to Bahasa Indonesia. At least our publisher, Gajah Mada University Press, interested to translate this book. And so much more Indonesian public can read this book and also write a critical review to your book. Yeah, I think thank you for Pak Wahid for organizing these discussions. Thank you, Arnout, for presence here, and Pak Margana for discussions, and all of the participants from undergraduate students to doctoral students from Universitas Gadjah Mada who present here, and some college and Indonesian historians who present here. So thank you. Selamat siang, selamat tengah malam, Arnout di Amerika.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih. And
thank you, Wildan. Thank you, Arnout.